This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Women's Equality Day was earlier this week on August 26th. It's called Women's Equality Day on August 26th because that was when the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which allowed women the right to vote, was accepted in Washington, D.C. in 1920. So we remember Women's Equality Day on August 26th. My show today is mostly about women from September, that is to say, September birthdays of women. And we'll have pictures of most of them. Beginning for September 1st, Lily Tomlinson. Lily Tomlinson was born in Detroit in 1937, and she was a TV star and feminist, and she may very well be still around. I'm not sure, I must say, but I had certainly heard of her as an actress. On the 2nd of September, we have a woman called Bryher, B-R-Y-H-E-R. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. It might be just plain Breer, but she was born Annie Ellerman on September 2nd in 1894 in England. And she was a well-known woman in her time, especially as a partner of Hilda Doolittle, who actually has a September birthday, and we'll talk about H.D. later. But Breyer became her partner in 1918. On September 3rd, we have Prudence Crandall. Prudence Crandall was born in Rhode Island in 1803, and she was a teacher, an educator. She opened a school in Massachusetts in the 19th century, and quite a few women sent their children to her school, their daughters, but these were all white women. And when she accepted a black girl as a student, many of the women who had sent their white daughters to the school removed their daughters because of the racism that was apparent in those days, even among people who were abolitionists sometimes. But Prudence Crandall was a well-known educator and is remembered as opening this school, which tried to teach black student girls. On September 4th, we have Mary Renault. Mary Renault wrote a lot of books. They were historical novels for the most part, and she did good research in the times, ancient times actually. Most of the people that she wrote about were Greek or Latin people from classic days. But for instance, The Bull from the Sea was one that she wrote, The Persian Boy, The King Must Die. These were all historical novels that talked about famous and not so famous people, but people who lived in the ancient Greek and Latin times. Mary Renault, and she was born on September 4th in 1905 in London. Our person for the 5th of September is Sarah Edmonds. Sarah Edmonds, this is actually a death date. She died at about age 56 in Texas in 1898, so this is a death date. She was a Civil War nurse and spy, and passed sometimes as a man, when she was known as Frank. In fact, I think that when she served in the Civil War as a spy, the people she was working with thought she was a man, but they had her dress up as a woman to act as a spy, which is kind of a twist, isn't it? But this was Sarah Edmonds, and she died in 1898, which of course was more than 30 years after the end of the Civil War, the American Civil War, in which she had served as a nurse and a spy. For September 6th, we have Jane Addams. This is Jane Addams, the famous co-founder of Hull House in Chicago. She was born on September 6th in 1860 in Illinois, and she had a wonderful time in college, and then when she got out of college, she didn't know what to do with herself. So she finally went abroad for a couple of years and decided that she would come back to the States and open a place, a sort of refuge and, well, they call it a settlement house, Hull House in Chicago. It was a place where people who were poor or immigrant folks could go and enjoy a library. It was the first public playground that they had in Chicago, was at Hull House. And she and people who worked at Hull House, many women volunteered there and went on to important jobs or important work for women and women's rights, and that was thanks to Jane Addams. For the 7th of September, we have a very famous woman from history, Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I was born in Greenwich, England in 1533, one of the children of King Henry VIII of England. And you've probably heard that King Henry VIII had 6 wives. Elizabeth was the daughter of the second wife, who was one of the ones that Henry VIII had beheaded for supposedly fooling around with other men. But anyway, her little daughter grew up and sometimes spent long periods of time in the Tower of London, which was basically a jail. But after her brother, who became king first, he was the Edward VI, I believe, and he reigned for 6 years and he died. Then her sister Mary, who was the oldest of the children of Henry VIII, and was a Catholic at a time when Henry VIII had brought Protestantism, the Church of England, into being. But she served as queen for 6 years and tried to reinstate Catholicism, but it didn't work, and she finally died. And then her sister Elizabeth became queen and reigned for 45 years. She was a backer of exploration. She worked very hard to keep peace with Spain and France, that were both powerful states, probably more powerful than England at the time. but she managed to keep it going. You know, she said she might have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but she had the heart and stomach of a king. And she certainly put her name into history. Elizabeth I of England, born on September 7th in 1533. For September the 8th, we have a woman called Lady Bruliana Harley. Lady Bruliana Harley was born in the Netherlands, but she lived in England, and she had a castle in England. And during the times that were very Civil War times, basically, you might say, in England, she defended the castle of her husband, who, and that was in Hereford in England. And she was born in well, actually, she defended the castle probably in 1643. It would have had to have been then if it was during the times of the English Civil Wars. For September 9th, we have a death date. And the woman who is named in the book that I use is Rebecca Lemp. She was in Germany, in Swabia, in Nordlingen. And this death date in 1590, that was one of those bad times when they were really after witches. And it says that she was one of 32 women who were burned as witches in the year 1590 in Germany, Rebecca Lamp. For September 10th, we have an American woman born in Pennsylvania in 1886. Her name, Hilda Doolittle. Hilda Doolittle, often called HD, which of course are her initials for Hilda Doolittle. HD, born in 1886 in Pennsylvania, was a poet and writer of other books. And she was a partner of the woman born on September 2nd, Breyer. Anyway, H.D. was also an author, well-known author in her time in the early part of the last century, the 1920s and so on. She was a well-known poet. And for September 11th, we have Joanna Baillie. Joanna Baillie was born in Scotland in 1762, and she was another woman who was an author, a writer. She was a poet and playwright. She wrote a number of plays, and interestingly, she wrote a series of plays on the emotions. And those were well received in her time. Some people thought that was kind of strange to just have all these plays that it was actually called passions, plays on the passions. So it would be on emotions like love and jealousy and hate and so on. Apparently she wrote a play on all the different passions back in the 18th century. And one of the famous actresses of that day, Sarah Siddons, backed her whole idea about these plays of passions and appeared in them in the late 18th century. Some people thought that they couldn't believe that these were plays written by a woman. In fact, she was probably the first well-known woman playwright. And some of them thought that the plays had actually been written by a man, but of course, that's not the case. They were written by Joanna Bailey. For September 12th, we have Maria Agnesi. My Italian is not too good. She was an Italian woman born in Milan, Italy, in 1718. And they're not sure of the exact date. This is one of the people who was assigned a time. They knew that she was born in 1718, but not the day and the year and so on. So our author of Remember the Ladies assigned her to September 12th. She was a famous mathematician and scientist in her day, one of the first well-known women scientists. She wrote a mathematics book that they say was used as a text for 50 years. But later in her life, she turned from science study and mathematics study and writing to run a hospital for poverty-stricken people. And so she was known as someone who really cared for the poor and helpless people of her day by running this hospital that she had. And she was appointed actually as a professor of mathematics, but she never actually took up the role. She was appointed by Pope Benedict XIV to serve at the University of Bologna in Italy, but she never actually did teaching there. She was glad to actually turn to helping the poor in the hospitals. Now, for the 13th of September, we have a picture that shows two people. These two people are the Schumanns. Robert Schumann was a well-known musician and author in the 19th century. His wife, Clara Wieck Schumann, was a child prodigy as a piano player. Robert Schumann was also a famous piano player. So she married Schumann when she was 21, after having had a childhood and teenage tours of Europe as a child prodigy pianist herself. But she became a wife and mother and had a number of children to look after, about half a dozen children to look after, and helping her husband out. He died relatively young, and she spent the rest of her life promoting him and his music. So it's nice that we have a picture of Robert as well as a picture of Clara Wieck Schumann here. For 14th of September, we have two pictures actually. This first picture is a picture of a t-shirt that I have called Trust Women, Protect Choice, because September 14th is the birthday of Margaret Higgins Sanger, born in New York State in 1879. And this is a picture of Mrs. Sanger, who was a founder of Planned Parenthood. And she definitely ran the first Planned Parenthood type of clinic in Brooklyn over 100 years ago, in 1916 and 17. But the whole idea that women should be able to control their fertility, their bodies, and choose perhaps not to become mothers was very, very suspect and illegal, actually, back in 1916 when this clinic was first opened. And it was only in the 1920s and 30s that Planned Parenthood really got going. But Margaret Sanger was around to promote contraception and choice on abortion back in the day, in the late teens of the last century and in the 20s of the last century. One of the things she said was that no woman can call herself free who doesn't own and control her own body. There are many people, of course, who oppose abortion for moralistic reasons. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a question of putting the welfare of the unborn, the fetus, over the welfare of the woman who is pregnant. And I think that that's a bad idea. So I'm very glad that Margaret Sanger was active and promoted contraception and Planned Parenthood back in the day. For the 15th of September, we have a woman called Murasaki. Now, as you can see, she lived a long time ago. She lived in Japan. It says she was born in Japan about 978, that is to say, before the year 1000 AD. She was a Japanese author and woman, and she wrote probably the best-known classic story to come out of Japan at any time, and that was called The Tale of Genji. It was the first surviving long novel, which she wrote about the year 1000 AD in Japan. So this picture gives an idea of Murasaki in Japan in the year 1013, which I think was when she left the court of the Empress of Japan and turned to writing, especially for the Tale of Genji. She's still known, and that is the best-known classic story that came out of Japan in all those years. For September 16th, we have Anne Bradstreet. Anne Bradstreet, and this was a death day for Anne Bradstreet, September 16th, 1672. So she was a woman who was in Pilgrim, Massachusetts. In fact, her father served as the governor of Pilgrim, Massachusetts, and later her husband served as the governor of Massachusetts. Anne Bradstreet died at about age 60 in the year 1672. But she had been known for a number of decades as an American poet because her brother had her poems printed in England without her knowledge. I guess she didn't promote this at all, but he had them printed in the 1650s, and it was called The 10th Muse, Lately Sprung in America. So she was, one of the poems that she wrote about Queen Elizabeth, who had lived, not long before her own time. And she said, this was Anne Bradstreet speaking about Queen Elizabeth I. She had Queen Elizabeth I proclaim, "Let such as say our sex is void of reason. No, 'tis a slander now, but once was treason." And that refers to the fact that, of course, when Queen Elizabeth was this queen for 45 years, as I mentioned earlier, because of her birth date on September 7th, people that said that women had no reason could be held as traitors to the Queen of England, who reigned for 45 years, Queen Elizabeth I. But that was a bit from one of her poems, Anne Bradstreet. For also for that same day on the 16th of September, a woman called Louise Arner Boyd, born in San Rafael, California in 1887. And she was a world traveler, and especially she was a traveler in the Arctic areas. So the picture shows her with a map of Greenland, of a part of Greenland, because she made trips to the Arctic area, including northern Canada and also to Greenland. She made 9 trips to the Arctic, and she took photographs of the Arctic, and she visited it in the summertime, but in the wintertime it was solid ice right across the sea practically. Back in those days, the climate is warmer now than it was when Louise Arner Boyd was born in 1887, and in the early part of the last century was an Arctic explorer and photographer. Says she battled muskox, polar bears, rough water, fire on board of the ships, wooden ships those would have been. And she survived it all, but she was a woman from California, Louise Boyd. For September 17th, we have a woman called Little Mo Connolly. Little Mo Connolly is shown with a tennis racket because that was she was quite an athlete. She was an athlete in different sports, but best known probably as a tennis athlete. When she was young, when she was a teenager, I mean, she was winning tennis matches in her teens. And in fact, in 1952, she won the U.S. title for the second time, and also won that same time in Wimbledon in England as a tennis sports person. In 1954, she won again at Wimbledon, and she was named as the Associated Press Woman Athlete of the Year. That was in 1954 when she was only 20 years old, because she was born in 1934 in San Diego, California. Unfortunately, she had a terrible accident which ended her career at age 20 because her leg was crushed, it said, in a riding accident. And her career as a famous American athlete was at an end. Mo Connolly. For the 18th of September, we see Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo, born Greta Gustafsson in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1905 on September 18th. She dropped out of school in her early teens, but she went to the Royal Dramatic Theatre School later and became a big success as an actress in the 1920s and 30s in particular. She played in some 24 films. 10 of those were in the still days in the 1920s, but 14 of Greta Garbo's films were talkies, as they were called once. The first talkie that she did was Anna Christie. And she had a signature voice in addition to her great beauty. She had a very husky voice, very memorable, and sort of a Swedish accent to it as well. So they said that she said something like, "I want to be alone." What she actually meant was, "I want to be left alone." And she became famous for that after her retirement in 1941. She avoided publicity and tried to keep away from photographers who would sometimes stand outside her apartment building in New York City in hopes of catching a glimpse of her and getting a photograph after her retirement in 1941. But she wanted to be left alone. For the 19th of September, we have Mary Jemison. And this is a statue of Mary Jemison. She was captured by Indians as a teenager and lived the rest of her life as a Seneca Indian. Married a Seneca brave and had 3 children. And she was known as the White Woman of the Genesee. This was a death date, actually, September 19th. She died at about age 90 on Buffalo Creek, near Buffalo, New York, and that was in 1833. So that means that she would have been captured in the 1750s. She was captured by the Seneca in the 1750s and lived her life, the rest of her life, as an Indian woman, the White Woman of the Genesee. She had opportunities to return to the white living, but she preferred being an Indian. She'd been a white woman, or practically a woman, at least a teenage person, before her capture, and she decided she wanted to be an Indian woman, and she was. Mary Jemison, dying at 1833 at about age 90 in New York State. For the 20th of September, we have Harriet E. Adams Wilson, and she is shown here on the cover. There's a photograph of her on the cover of her novel, which was published in 1859 and was the first novel that became well known that had been written by a black author. It was called Our Nig. And so this picture shows the cover of a modern publication of Our Nig, but with a picture of Harriet Wilson. She was not a slave, but in fact, she settled in New Hampshire. She was not a Southerner, but she settled in New Hampshire and married an American sailor and had a son who unfortunately died later on. And it says that she is, they question why she's overlooked, the fact that she was the first woman, black author, basically. But maybe it was because the rest of the book's title was Our Nig, or Sketches from the Life of a Free Black in a Two-Story White House, North, showing that slavery's shadows fall even there. So apparently she experienced racism in New England, the author of Our Nig. And it has been eclipsed sort of by Linda Brent's book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which was published in 1861 and had many of the same descriptions, background of racism as Our Nig by Ms. Wilson. For the 21st of September, we have a woman much older, much longer ago, I guess I should say. Her name, Christine de Pizan. And this shows her writing in her diary. She was born in Venice in 1365. A really extraordinary woman with a good education, an author, and one of the first of the feminists in the European West, the first professional female author in European history, Christine de Pizan, born in 1365 on September 21st. She didn't hang around long in Venice because her father moved to France when she was just a little girl. And she wrote in French, basically. But she also knew Italian, French, and probably Latin, it says. And she didn't marry. She had a happy married life for 10 years and had 3 children before the death of her husband. Her father had died earlier, and he had been a well-known man who had served the King of France. And so here she was left a widow and an orphan, and she had 3 children and a mother-in-law to take care of. So she started writing, and she wrote a book called The Book of the Women of Ladies, the Book of the City of Ladies. The Book of the City of Ladies, and that was published about the year 1400. It's the first book by a European woman author in history, Christine de Pizan. For the 22nd of September, we have, this shows 3 women actually. The woman who has the birthday on September 22nd is the one in the middle, as Christabel Pankhurst. To her right is her mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, and all 3 of these women were very strong feminists who worked and went to jail. You know, they committed violent acts to protest the fact that women couldn't vote. They were violent suffragists, in fact, suffragettes. And Christabel is the one in the middle, but her sister was also involved, and definitely the mother, Emmeline, who's shown on the far left as you see the picture. So she was a writer and an activist, of course, and she also edited a publication called The Suffragette, because that's what they worked on night and day until the passage in 1920 of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, which was, as I mentioned earlier, we recognized August 26th, just a couple of days ago, as Women's Equality Day, because that was when women got the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. For September 23rd, we see Victoria Woodhull. Victoria Woodhull was an Ohio woman. She was born in a little town called Homer, which is to the east of Columbus, about 20 miles or so. And she was born in 1838, so she was named after the new queen in England, because 1838 was the year that Victoria of England was born. So she was quite a gal, and she came from a family. The father was a peddler of snake oil, you might say. He sold potions to people that claimed it would cure any kind of problem that they might have. Don't know whether it did or not. And he also put on a show as doing mesmerism, you know, putting people to sleep and mesmerizing them and talking to them and so on. She worked in that show with her dad and her sister named Tennessee. And that was the Claflin family. Her maiden name was Claflin, Victoria Claflin. But she married a Dr. Woodhull when she was only 14. Well, it turned out to be a kind of a problem, because he was not only a very heavy drinker, but also a drug addict. And they eventually divorced. But she moved to New York eventually, and he went right along, and so did her second husband and her 2 children, and so on. And she got in touch with a well-known financier, whose name you've probably heard, because this was, well, let's see, I should get his name here. I'm missing it for a minute. But his name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the one and only big banking man and financier. And she and her sister opened their own brokerage firm in New York City, and they did so well that they earned $250,000 in 2 years, what with the being promoted by Cornelius Vanderbilt himself and so on. She also published a weekly magazine, and it says in its pages she advocated free love, liberalized divorce laws, communal parenting, women's suffrage, legalized prostitution, and spiritualism. Something for everyone. Victoria Woodhull. She later married an Englishman and moved to England and lived in England with her family, most of whom went over from the U.S. to England to stay with her, because she'd married quite a well-to-do man in England, and they were living in a very fancy place and so forth. So Victoria was quite a personage in her time, an editor, an activist. Victoria Woodhull, born right here in Homer, Ohio, in 1838 on September 23rd. And the 24th of September is the birth date of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She was born in 1825. She was a black woman who was a well-known author in her day, and her maiden name was Watkins, but she actually lived for a time, quite an important time in her life. In the 1850s, she lived near Columbus, Ohio, when she married her husband, Watkins. And she became the first black female lecturer with the Maine Anti-Slavery Society. And she wrote and lectured on abolition and temperance in New England and around the United States, especially in the northern part of the United States. She was born a free black in Maryland, in Baltimore, but she was a free black, not ever a slave herself. But of course, she championed abolition very widely. And after the Civil War, she was a well-known lecturer across, especially across the North during Reconstruction times. And she headed the WCTU's Black Division, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was established in 1876 and apparently had a separate organization for black women, WCTU. She was superintendent of that division in the 1880s. Her novel, Eola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, is often considered the most important novel by a black woman before the publication of Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And that was in the 1930s that Hurston was writing. But we mentioned earlier the fact that Our Nig had been published by a black woman earlier, Ms. Wilson. But this one, Eola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, was published in 1892 and was probably the first really popular novel about black life, by a black woman novelist. And she was a co-founder of the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896 for black women, and an important author in her own times, for sure. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. September 24th has been assigned to a woman called Wettamoo, who was an Indian woman of the Wampanoag tribe in Massachusetts. And this is an idea of what she might have looked at like, but of course no one knows for sure. She was born in the 17th century, in the 1600s, in other words, and they don't know for sure when, so she was assigned by our author, Kirsten Olston of Remember the Ladies. She was assigned to September 24th. Wettamoo was an important person in her day. She married the son of Chief Massasoit. Massasoit was an Indian who got along well with the Pilgrims and signed a treaty with them, and he stuck by them, and I guess they stuck by him. But after Massasoit's death, the whites pretty well turned on the Indians, and the Indians pretty well turned on them under Wettamoo's husband. and actually the time that there was really a bad war between the whites and the Indians in 1675. It's called King Philip's War, and King Philip was actually a brother-in-law of Wetamoog. He was another son of Massasoit. So she is certainly considered an important American Indian of the Wampanoag tribe. But in the King Philip's War, she was killed. She was shot and killed, and her head was even displayed in Boston, I think it was. Yeah, no, in Plymouth, but Plymouth in Massachusetts, of course, in 1675 during the King Philip's War, so-called. September 25th is the birth date of Sarah Bernhardt. Sarah Bernhardt was a famous actress of the 19th and early 20th century. She was born in 1844 in Paris, and she was an actress who was, for decades, she was probably the best known actress. And of course, she could do both French and English, because she was Parisian born. French was her first language. But she made tours in the United States and in London during her lifetime, so I'm sure she must have been quite fluent in English as well. It's said that she particularly liked to play male roles. She several times performed as Hamlet, and of course Hamlet, the famous play by William Shakespeare, Hamlet is a male, obviously. She preferred males. Why? Because she preferred the male brain. Male parts are more intellectual than female parts. Okay, you play a woman, you play a female, you're emotional, you cry, you laugh, you smile, you love people, you hate people, etc. But male roles are more likely to be about more intelligent, intellectual things. And so I guess that's why Sarah Bernhardt said that she preferred playing a male role when she could get one. And she sometimes did, like I say, play Hamlet. For the 26th of September, we have a death date of Bessie Smith. And this shows Bessie Smith, who was a well-known singer in the 1920s and 30s. She died at age 39 in 1937 on September 26th in Mississippi. But she was a well-known blues singer. She popularized the St. Louis blues, St. Louis blues. That was her signature song, St. Louis blues. And she sang other blues songs as well, including Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out. And she also even made a short film. But she had problems getting bookings, as a black woman especially, and as a blues singer specialist. Mostly people would like to hear her sing in honky-tonks, I guess. And those were the days when She was starting in her singing career of Prohibition in American history. But, and she died young, as I've mentioned. She died at 39, and it was a sad occasion. She was in Mississippi. She was in a car accident, and they took her, gravely wounded from this accident to the nearest hospital. Well, the nearest hospital was whites only, back in the day. Very deep segregation in Mississippi. And by the time they got her to the colored hospital, she was apparently too far gone. So she died at age 39 in Mississippi, the well-known blues singer Bessie Smith. On the 27th of September, we have Babe Didrikson Zacharias, the woman athlete par excellence. This shows her as a professional golf player, but she had played all sorts of sports as a, before she turned pro as a golfer. She had won sports as an amateur athlete. She died at age 45, this is a death date, in Galveston, Texas in 1956. But she was a consummate athlete, known for all the different kinds of athletics she could do, in addition to being a professional golfer. And of course, the problem with being an amateur is you don't get any money. Well, for September 28th, we have Frances Willard, born in 1834, goodness. And she was a founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. She was president of the Chicago branch of the WCTU and the national WCTU, and led the fight for prohibition. But she was also a very big feminist and lobbyist. For the September 29th, we have Elizabeth Gaskell. Elizabeth Gaskell was a novelist born in 1810 on September 29th, known for 6 novels, Elizabeth Gaskell, during the 19th century, born in London in 1810. And for the 30th of September, we have a woman called Manthati Tisi, born in the Orange Free State of South Africa, about 1780, before there really was an Orange Free State. But she was a person who she and her husband were fighters against the Boers, that is to say, the white Dutch settlers of South Africa, Manthati Tisi. So there we have our September birthdays, and this is Lois Whaley